Hi, I'm Sherry with Whole Circle Studio, and welcome to week 5 of the Butterfly Bunch Quilt Along. This is the final week. I hope you've been having a lot of fun. Last week we got all of our butterflies together, and this week I'm going to show you some of my strategies for quilting it. So first off, you could see I have my quilt here basted. I wanted to show you the back first. I actually picked out this really pretty Allison Glass fabric from an earlier Sun print collection that complemented the latest Sun print collection that I used of hers for the butterflies. So once I picked out that backing fabric, I was ready to start basting. I like to pin baste, as you could see here, and I use a lot of pins. My rule of thumb is putting them about 3 fingers together and alternating the directions, as you could see here. I find by doing this, I really don't fight with puckers and folds, and it makes the quilting process a lot smoother. And then I just take the pins out as I go along. It does slow down the quilting process because you're stopping and starting to take out pins, but I actually quilt a lot using my walking foot, and you should be going slower. It's a walking foot for a reason. You shouldn't be speeding, you should be walking. So if you need some extra help basting, I actually have a tutorial on my blog, and down below I'll put the link to that below this video so you can check that out. And I actually pin baste using this exact table that you see here. Everything from minis like this to large queen size. So be sure to check that out. So now that I have it pin basted, I am going to use my walking foot to quilt. I do usually prefer that. I really like the stitch consistency of the walking foot, although I will venture into free motion quilting every now and again. So Quilting Designs, I for the most part really look at my quilt top and all the seams, and I follow the seams as a guide. I kind of let the seams talk to me as far as figuring out how I want to quilt it, and just follow those seams, or at least start by following a seam. I find that this really accentuates the quilt top versus fighting with it. Of course, rules are meant to be broken, and you can quilt it any way you want. And in fact, I quilted this butterfly version, which are the same blocks but in a different configuration, not in a circle. You could see here I actually just started with the butterflies, and I followed the outside seam and then used that stitch as a guide for the next stitch, and so on. But the background I did freeform. For this layout, I really wanted the motion from the lower left to the upper right of sort of this flutter of butterflies. And these were actually all done with a walking foot. However, I did not clearly follow a seam. I went a little bit freeform. But let's talk about the mini. So for my mini, I think what I'm going to do, it's always good to start in the middle and go out when you quilt as much as possible. Of course, rules are meant to be broken. I'm actually going to start in the middle, but not the exact middle. I'm going to follow this seam. This is a pretty prominent seam, and it's sort of like a star, which kind of makes the butterflies sort of motion from the inside out, which I really like a lot. So I'll show you how I'm going to attack that in a minute. What I also like to do sometimes, if I'm not quite sure, is I have a roll of tracing paper, and I'll just put tracing paper over my quilt top, and I can just then sketch out with a pencil, and I can do that as many times as I'd like until I'm happy with my design scheme. You can always pin it over and kind of evaluate it for a couple of days and see what you think. And that's a really good way to kind of test out without having to rip stitches out later. I'll also, if it is sort of a free motion, if I don't have a seam to follow, I'll use my Hera marker, and by just creasing, I'll do some in the corner. And some colors it shows up better than others. I can draw free form, or I can draw straight lines. And I don't know if this is showing up on the video, but you can kind of see a little bit of a crease. And when you have good lighting near your machine, you could just follow those lines, and then the creases will eventually just come out by themselves, and it doesn't damage the fabric, which I really like. And that's how I achieved some of these wavy lines. I marked one out and then a couple out here and there, and used that as a guide, and then just filled in. So the Hera marker I'll also have a link to down below of where to get one of these. And then the other thing you'll want to think about is thread color. I really love to match thread colors. Again, not a hard and fast rule, but generally I do that. The reason being, I feel like then the quilt top is really the star of the show if I'm matching it and I'm not competing with designs. The thread isn't competing with the overall design. So here are some of the threads that I chose. My yellow's already in the machine. One other tip is oftentimes if you just put a thread down, these look like they match, but sometimes it doesn't look like it's a good match. But once you start unraveling it, it matches. And I'll just put one single thread. Again, remember, you're not going to see a whole spool on top when you stitch, but you'll see a thread. And these I was looking at earlier. I thought these were a really good match. The other good thing about matching is if you do have imperfections in your quilting, it will not be as noticeable. If you have a high contrast thread, color thread against your fabric, any imperfections will show. So if that's what you're trying to achieve, I definitely recommend matching your threads. Good, so I already know I'm gonna start on this line and use that as a guide. So I'm gonna go over to my machine. And I typically really vary what my stitch length is going to be. For minis or tight spaces, I'll keep it on a 2 or 2.5. For bigger quilts or bigger areas, I sometimes go up to a 3. I like those bigger stitches sometimes, but again, it's just a matter of personal opinion. So we're gonna get the quilt in here. And I'm just gonna, like I said, I wanna follow this seam right here. And I'm gonna draw up on the blog post, just indicating what seam that is. And then I'm just gonna use the foot, or sort of the prong of my walking foot to follow that seam along. I'm going to take this pin out. The other handy tool for taking these pins out are these this quick clip, which again I'll link to, and it saves on hurting your fingers. So I'm just going to take this one pin out, and I like to keep a little glass jar for my pins. I'll leave that over there. And I'm just going to I'm going to use the inside of my prong. Sometimes I'll use the outside. I also have a guide that clips into my walking foot, but I don't need it today. I'm going to stick that in. I'm going to do my thread length to about a 2.5 millimeter. I'm not going to worry about the tail for right now. I'm going to show you how to bury that thread. And I'm just going to stitch along. Again, stopping. It's actually a little faster than I do like to go. And the other thing is I forgot to do, I'm going to move my presser foot up a little bit, which it already was, just to give it some extra, because I'm going through 3 layers. You want that presser foot, if you have an adjustable one, on the up position. I'm just going to follow along. And I'm just using the inside of my foot to follow along that seam. I'm going to approximate where that blue is, and then I'm just where the blue is, and I'm just going to shift this around, and there is a pin in my way. This is one of the hazards of having lots of pins, but again, I find that I have a lot less puckers, and I should have taken that out a little bit earlier. So there we go. It's a little bit easier. I'm just going to, with my needle down always, rotate this around. That line is looking beautiful. The yellow is really blending in, which is what I was hoping. And I'm going to shift it around. And I'm just going to do this all the way around. Oh, yeah. Good. So I'm going to follow that all the way around. What I wanted to show you when I start and stop is how I bury threads. And that means just I have this long thread here, and I have the back thread, the bobbin thread here. What I'll typically do is just cut threads and then bury them all at once. It does create a little bit of a mess, but I'll show you how I do that. First, there's a couple of tools I like to use. I have this thread pick that I like, and I find that this is actually really great for cutting out, instead of using a seam ripper, for taking out threads all in one piece. So I'll gently kind of tug on the top thread and pull that last stitch so the back bobbin thread comes up. So I have both threads here. And then what I'll use is, I have one of my needles here, an easy threading needle, and I like the Tulip brand. I'll link to that as well, just so you could see what I use, but there's lots of other brands as well. The needle actually has a little sort of, you don't have to thread it through the eye. You can just take the two pieces of thread and kind of plunk it in, and it's in there. So you don't have to, there's no eye to thread through. It's sort of just two little pieces of metal that you can kind of just slide the threads into. And then what I do is, however you can make a knot, I like to take the pieces of thread between my two fingers like this and make a knot. Sorry, take this backwards. So I have them the two in there, and I'll just make a knot. And there's a little knot there. I'll take my needle and put the thread through, and then I'm going to go back through that hole, the first hole that my needle, my sewing machine needle pierced through. Go in, and I'm right underneath the top layer, between the top layer and the batting. You don't want the thread going through the back, and I could feel that I'm there. If I wasn't sure, I can look in the back and make sure I don't see the needle, and I don't. So that means that those threads will be tucked through, and then I just pull the needle through. I felt a little pop, that knot going in there, and then I'll just cut that thread off. So I do that a lot with starting and stopping. You can certainly travel to the next line. So to finish this, I'll go all the way around. I'll come back to where I started. I'll cut the thread and then bury it. Or I could just travel, meaning just quilt along, keep quilting along. What I'll probably do next is take my foot and use it as a guide against the line I just sewed and quilt another line, probably about a ½ inch in, and follow that all the way along. I'll continue that strategy for the whole mini quilt until it's done. So I hope this was helpful. I hope you're having a lot of fun with the quilt along, and I can't wait to see your finished butterfly bunch mini quilts. Thanks so much.